Good morning, Penny family. It's actually Saturday night and I'm in my garage as I record this. Last week I was not with you present on Sunday morning because my kids had tested positive for COVID. We were quarantining with them and we didn't want to share anything with you. Kel and I were fine. We tested negative. We wanted to make sure we didn't share COVID with you. And Kel and I thought we were going to be fine. And then I guess because sharing is caring, my kids shared COVID with me. So my kids are doing fine. They're doing great. Kelly is fine. She tested negative today. But midweek I had a breakthrough case. I started with symptoms and then tested positive. So it felt pretty crummy the end of the week. Still, of course, in quarantine throughout this upcoming week. But I come out of quarantine next weekend, and I hope at the beginning of the weekend, next weekend, I hope to be with you on Sunday morning, Lord willing, as we're learning to say. Now, many who grow up in the Christian faith have this kind of experience. You venture out into the world outside of your home and your church, and you step into environments and circumstances that challenge the faith that you have and that you grew up with, whether that happens in high school or college, or whether that's through entering the workforce and heading out on a career path, or maybe that challenge to faith comes in the school of hard knocks, which is a real thing. You get hit hard with circumstances, challenges that make you question whether what you have believed about God and His relationship to you is true or not. Challenges your assumptions. And whether it's through exposure to other people or being challenged by arguments or being hit by hard circumstances, many of us know what it is to go out into the world and to have the faith that we thought we knew suddenly seem difficult to hold on to. Impossible to hold on to in the same way that we had it before. Changed, challenged. And at this point, speaking very broadly about the kinds of challenges that people face, I think when people come to this kind of a place where the faith that they've had is challenged in one of these ways, speaking very broadly, they tend to go two ways. It's not going to surprise you. They either walk away from the faith for a time or for the rest of their lives. They either walk away or they move deeper through question, through doubt, through seasons of struggle, but ultimately deeper into the faith they held before. It's the same faith, but it's changed now. Stronger, maybe more humble, but still firm and even stronger. When we start the story of Daniel today, we are introduced to Daniel and his friends when they're around the age of high school graduates. They're maybe a little bit younger, but they're in that range. They are young men when we're introduced to them. And they are young men who have grown up in the city of Jerusalem. They've grown up in the nobility. Some have theorized, though the Bible doesn't say this, that they are descendants of King Hezekiah, a faithful king. They've grown up in and around the city of Jerusalem and the palace in Jerusalem and in the worship of Jerusalem. They have grown up being raised in the faith of God, the God of their people, the God of Israel. They've grown up going to the temple in Jerusalem for regular worship. They've grown up being educated to serve this God and His people in the city of Jerusalem. And then their life is suddenly and violently changed. They are thrust into the school of hard knocks. They are carried away by a hostile power. They lose their families, their homes, their homeland. And then they are set down in a proud and majestic city, the city of Babylon. They are put into a new school, an ancient and intimidating learning environment, educational system that is devoted to gods other than the God of Israel. Taken away, challenging circumstances, and educated in a way that would seem to be designed to educate them out of the faith of their youth. And yet somehow, even by the end of this chapter, what we hear is of a faith and of the fact that these young men in these challenging circumstances kept the faith. Here are the questions I want to ask, actually. Let me put them a little bit differently. First question, and it is the first question always, in one way or another when we come to the biblical text. It's always the first question. Who is the God that we are called to put our faith in? If we're going to talk about living a life of faith, the first question is, who is this God we're called to believe in? He's the main character of every story in this book, the main subject of the Bible, and it's the first question we should ask. If we're talking about keeping faith, who are we to believe in? Number one. And number two, what is required of us if we are going to keep faith in God? In order to live a life of faith in this God, what is required of us? And then thirdly, why should you want to keep the faith at all? Why live this life? Why not just walk away? Well, first question. Start with the most important subject. Who is this God that we should believe in? And this answer of what this text shows us about who God is surprising. It comes in the first couple of verses of the book. Daniel chapter 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Oh, did you hear that? The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God that he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia. Now you see, this is immediately challenging us with our view of God. You can imagine as Daniel and as his friends are carried off, along with these articles from the temple, as they are carried off to Babylon, the question in their mind has got to be, where is God now? And surprise, the God that they have worshipped in Jerusalem is actually at work in and through the kingdom of Babylon to accomplish his purposes now. Babylon and its king, Nebuchadnezzar, are actually being used as an instrument of the hand of God in order to work his purposes. And so when Nebuchadnezzar comes down and besieges Jerusalem, comes and threatens and besieges Jerusalem, it is the Lord who delivers Daniel and his friends and eventually all of Judea itself into the hands of Babylon. Immediately we see that this God is surprising and transcendent, with purposes that confound our minds and working on a scope that is truly global. The God of the Bible is not a tribal God. He's not just the mascot of Jerusalem. One of the main points of the book of Daniel is that in all of the power plays and political struggles and rising and falling of kingdoms in the globe, over all of that is one God, the sovereign God of Israel, who is working his purposes in and through all of it. He is the God of all political powers. He is the God of all nations on the globe. He is the God of all the peoples of the world. He is the God of the four corners of the earth. He is not confined to Jerusalem or to the temple. And he has no rivals, even among the great powers of the day. God is Lord over all of them, and it is the Lord who is sovereignly at work, even as Jerusalem falls. Well, these verses, now, of course, that raises the question, why? Why would God do this? And these verses don't explain it. They just state it. They just state this fact. God delivered Judea into the hands of Babylon. But it is a major theme of the Old Testament and important for our background to answer that question now. You see it assumed when you get to Daniel chapter 9. But let's answer it now. Why does the Lord do this? Why does he deliver his people into the hands of Babylon? And the reason is found in a love story. It's the love story of God and Israel. God called Israel when he saved them from bondage in Egypt, when he called the nation out of slavery to himself. God saved them, and then he proposed to them at Mount Sinai. He proposed a covenant to them. He said to them, this is the essence of the covenant in one way. I will be your God and you will be my people. You maybe heard me say that before. It's actually in the Bible. I will be your God and you will be my people, meaning this. I will be your God. Everything that I have will be yours. The fullness of who I am will be yours. But then in exchange, in return, in covenant, you will be my people. You will worship only me and you will obey my laws. God proposed to the people and they said, yes. They said, yes. You be our God, we will be your people. And God said, well, listen, if you make this covenant, this is what you find in the law. You make this covenant that I will, and you keep it. You keep your part. I am your God. You worship me and keep my laws. I will bless you and I will protect you. You will be a nation like no other nation on earth. But if you break this covenant, if you forsake me, if you worship other gods, if you break my laws, you will receive from me not blessing but curse, not loving kindness, but hard consequence. I will judge you. Keep my covenant, or there will be consequences. And the people said, yes, we agree. We will be your people, you will be our God. But the sad story of Israel told throughout the history and in the prophets and across the Old Testament is that the people did not keep their covenant. They broke it. They broke their covenant. They turned to idolatry. They sinned against God. They worshipped other gods. And with idolatry came immorality and injustice. The people did wrong. And so you read, and so God sent them prophets, I should say. He sent them prophets, messengers, to call them to return to him, to repent, to turn back to him, to come back to loving him, or else they would face the consequences. Over hundreds of years, God sent prophets. They ignored the prophets. They rejected them. They turned from God. So Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 1, you have forgotten the Lord, the one who made you, the one who called you, the one who saved you. You have turned from him. And he also says, your hands are full of blood. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Come now, Isaiah says, let us reason together. Though your sins are as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Turn back before it's too late. But Israel would have none of it. They were stiff-necked, and they disobeyed. And ultimately, God sent judgment upon them as he had warned them he would do. And he delivered them into the hands of the Babylonians. And this is, remember our question, who is the God that we are called to believe in? Who is this God? He is the sovereign God of the whole earth, but he is a sovereign God who is a holy judge. I read a few weeks ago that great passage from Exodus chapter 34 that speaks of God's character, in which God reveals who he is to the people of Israel. It says in Exodus 34 verses 6 and 7, this is the Lord speaking about who he is. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Wonderful. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. Slow to anger, ready to forgive, but a just judge of the whole earth. And this is one of the sobering truths of who God is in the book of Daniel. In fact, Daniel's name means God is my judge. That's what Daniel means. God is my judge. Who is the God we should believe in? A sovereign God, slow to anger, but who does not leave the guilty unpunished. Now, I wonder what you think about this kind of God. Because the Bible announces this is the God that we should believe in. This is the God we should have faith in. Vast, transcendent, bigger than you thought, global in scope, working in places. Who would have thought God was using the Babylonians? He was at work in places that Israel wouldn't have even naturally thought, doing things they didn't expect, and yet also a holy judge who doesn't play favorites, but judges with impartiality. holds even his people to account. That God that the Bible says is the real God, whether you believe it or not, that God is challenging. That God raises questions. That God is not simply solved. There aren't easy answers. That God challenges us. And in fact, one of the challenges of a life of growing faith is the shock that comes to us as we grow in faith, the shock that come to us of realizing that the God of our mind's eye, and maybe even the God we were raised with and taught and that was handed to us, that God is not the full God of the Bible. That what we had envisioned, what we had thought we'd known of God was smaller than the real thing, more simplistic, a more sentimental figure. The real God, the living God, is a challenging God, a holy God, and a gracious God. Don't simplify him. And in fact, let him challenge you. But at this point, let me just simply say, I know many people are troubled by the idea of God as a judge. Let me just point something out to you. Here's the thing that I've noticed. Many people who give up on a God of judgment, they say, I can't believe in a God of judgment. Those same people don't give up on judging for themselves. I can't believe in a God of judgment. I judge that God to be the wrong kind of judge. Right? And they keep judging God. I don't want God to judge me, but I will judge God. He can't be like that. Right? He can't be. That kind of God is out of bounds. I judge it to be so. People who give up, who don't like a God of judgment, I haven't found those people to be less judgy of other people as well. We are people who make judgments. You are. I am. We all do it. It's just, what is the standard we are judging by? The reason we make judgments too is because we have this deep sense that there is right and wrong, there is good and evil, that our actions matter, and so we need to judge wisely which way to go and what kind of life to live. We all make judgments. The God of the Bible comes to us and says, what is your standard for judgment? And he declares that ultimately there is one standard rooted in himself, this God beyond time and space, who determines what is right and wrong, who has put in your heart the knowledge deep down that there is right and wrong, and who will one day hold you to account. And now Daniel, if he's going to live this life with God as his judge, is going to have to live it not in Israel for all of its corruptions. He's going to have to live it in Babylon, a city dedicated to the worship of other gods, flush with immorality and injustice, oppression, imperial injustice. How do you live the life of faith in a world set against that kind of faith? Second question, what is required of us to live a life of faith? Let's just review what this first chapter says happens to Daniel that makes faith difficult. First, he is taken. They're taken, we see in verses 3 and 4, they're taken from their families, their homes, their homeland. These young men are carried to the most powerful city of the world, architectural marvels, libraries with long and rich literature of learning and culture. They were brought into the palace. It had a throne room, a large courtroom, special halls used for officials, a beautiful palace. And it was a palace they were brought into to serve the king, in which they would have been in this courtyard and in the surrounding buildings and in the throne room itself at times, and where they would see the king conducting business and the bureaucrats at work taking orders, and kings, vassal kings, vanquished kings who had been defeated from all over the world, sitting and coming and bringing tribute. And these young men are taken there. It's an environment meant to awe and also meant to tempt. The whisper is, now you can have a place here. Because they were taken in order to be taught how to serve this king. They're taught It says in verse 4, they were taught the language and literature of the Babylonians. They were assigned a daily amount from the king's table, and they were trained for 3 years, after which they were to enter the king's service. For 3 years they are taught the language of Babylon, the literature of Babylon, all the highest learning of Babylon, which was, by the way, a thoroughly pagan education devoted in large part to divination and astrology and interpreting dreams and signs. 3 years in a school, a pagan school. Yeah, there was a reason for all of this. Why are they taken away? He takes intentionally, it says in verse 3, the best and the brightest, 3 and 4, the best and the brightest from Israel. He takes them in order to teach them, in order to make them work for Babylon. Empires need servants. Not only does this cause a brain drain in the surrounding lands, but as these people are brought, the best and the brightest from all these servant countries in, they fill needs in this expanding empire. They serve the emperor in many different ways. And they are, in a sense, held hostage, taught to love Babylon, and held in Babylonian captivity in case any of their fellow Israelites have any bright ideas about rebellion. And so they are fed, it says in verse 5, from the king's table, so that they may enter, at the end of verse 5, the king's service. And the most potent sign that they are being made into tools for the emperor is that their names are changed. Verse 6, among these were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are their Hebrew names. And they're wonderfully significant. Daniel, as I said, means God is my judge. Hananiah means Yahweh, the name of Israel's God, has been gracious. Mishael means who is like God, or who is what God is. Azariah means Yahweh has helped me. These are names that are actually rooted in faith. Among these were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But the chief official gave them new names. New names. Who gives you new names? Your parents? God in the Bible gives new names when he claims someone for his service and his purposes and blessing. Well, now these people who've been taken away and taught this literature, they are now given new names, turned into tools of the Babylonian Empire. And the names are almost seem blasphemous. Daniel, which means God is my judge, his name is changed to Belteshazzar in honor of the Babylonian god Bel. Hananiah's name is changed to Shadrach, illuminated by the sun god. That's what that might mean. Mishael, his name is, who is what God is changed to Meshach, who is like Venus. And Azariah, Yahweh has helped, is changed to the name of Abednego. It's a servant of Nego, or perhaps servant of Nebo, who is the god of wisdom. In other words, they no longer have names that reflect the faith of the Hebrews. They now are named after the gods of Babylon. Daniel did not live in a neutral world, but a world with powerful, massive forces that were seeking to change him and to shape him. And by the way, we do not live in a neutral world either. There are powerful, massive forces that are seeking to shape us. That's not a conspiracy theory. I'm talking about social media companies and marketing departments and software designers with their algorithms and flashing lights on their phones, and political strategists and global corporations who are working to shape our vision of what's desirable, of what's important for us to pay attention to, of what's right to live for, of what we should buy, what we should spend our lives and our attention on, what we should believe. Movies and commercials and songs and podcasts and news providers and images and algorithms are powerful forces that I think we are becoming more aware of the fact that they are shaped by powerful forces that are not neutral. They have agendas. They are not just generally working for our good. They are tools designed to shape us, forces intended to conform us to the image of the world. And so the God we're to believe in is a God who is sovereign over everything and a judge. We're to live for him. How do you keep faith with this God in a world that is aligned against you? Well, this is what Daniel does. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself. That which defiles is that which makes one unholy in the sight of God. So it's clear here that he makes a resolution. He resolves to do that. Why? What's so important about the food? Why won't he eat it? Well, is it because it wasn't kosher? Well, no, wine was permitted in the kosher diet. Is it because it was dedicated to idols? Some have said no, but he still eats vegetables. So it can't be that. The vegetables likewise would have been dedicated to the worship of other gods, just like the meat would have been. Maybe it's because it's a sign of covenant. In the Old Testament, meeting together, eating with someone was a sign of covenant relationship with them. And that's probably closest to truth, though you note that later, in chapter 10, we find he is willing later to eat from that food. What seems from food from the king's table. What seems to have happened is that Daniel recognized at this key moment early on, he recognized that there are moments in which in the life, this is what John Goldengay, an Old Testament professor, writes. Daniel recognizes that there are moments when an issue in the life of the people of God requires one to take a confessional stand. Maybe on something that doesn't look inherently important, but that one recognizes is a make or break issue. In other words, Daniel realizes that at some point here, if he's going to stand for God, he's going to have to draw a line. He's going to have to say, this far, no further. He's going to say, I won't just be the tool of any king on earth. I must declare my allegiance to the God I am resolved to follow. And so Daniel resolved. And a life of faith does require this. It's not just mental assent. It requires a commitment. It requires of us commitment. Jesus, of course, called for this. Take up your cross, he said. Count the cost of following me, he said. He said, enter through the narrow gate, not the broad gate. Broad is the path to destruction. He says, but narrow is the road, small is the gate that leads to life. You must resolve to go in the way of Jesus, like Daniel did. And that resolution requires at some point you have to draw a line in the sand. And so what is required to live this kind of life in this world of conforming pressure, what is required is resolution. You must commit that you're going to follow this Jesus, and wisdom. You need wisdom to know where to draw the line. This doesn't seem to have been from chapter and verse. It just seems to be Daniel wisely deciding, I have to draw a line. Here is the place to draw it. But of course, he doesn't just have wisdom in choosing where to draw the line. Daniel also demonstrates wisdom in the way he goes about it. He resolves to draw the line, but then look at how he does it. He asked, verse 8, the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. And later when he speaks to the guard in verse 12, he says, please test your servants for 10 days. Now, he is not only wise in knowing he has to draw a line, he is also wise in knowing that you can draw lines without being a combative jerk. I mean, you can do that. In fact, as Christians, we're called to do that. Sinclair Ferguson, Old Testament scholar, he writes, Daniel is presented here as a model of faithful witness in the attractiveness of his life and the graciousness of his resistance. And as we go through this book, we'll see that characterizes him throughout. He is willing to say no and yet gracious even in his resistance. Now, what we said is, who is the God we're called to believe in? The sovereign, transcendent, holy God of the Bible, challenging God. What is required if you're going to live that kind of life in this world? Well, this world is not neutral, so what is required is resolve. You have to commit. There is a commitment called for to the life of faith. and wisdom to know how to navigate it, because it is not always clear how to navigate where to draw the line when it is unclear, and how to do that with grace. This is what keeping the faith requires of us. So the last question, more briefly, why then should we live it? Why live that life in the first place? And I think there are a couple of answers given here. The first, and importantly, is because this is the way of truth. Interestingly, Daniel resolves to live this life, but he gives himself, even as he does, to his studies in the city of Babylon. Daniel goes about learning everything they have to teach him. He learns, it says in verse 17, the knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. That's Babylonian literature and learning. He went to the depths of it. He understood everything the Babylonians knew. And so, in fact, in verse 20, it says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned him, Daniel was found to have 10 times more knowledge than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. He passes the test and then some. Better, he knows the Babylonian literature better than the Babylonians. We are surrounded by forces that would seek to deceive us and conform us. So we must resolve to take every thought captive to Christ, as it says in 2 Corinthians. But before setting up all kinds of walls and barriers to engagement, walling ourselves off from the world and from the life of the mind, before doing that, we had better read verse 17 and reckon with it. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. God gave Daniel and his friends deep knowledge of the knowledge of the Babylonians. All truth is God's truth. And we can engage with the world and still be people of faith, and because the faith that we have is based in the truth of the God who is the God of all truth. And the God we know first and foremost through the truth of his word and the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, but who is also known in his works in this world, and the common grace, learning of other human beings made in the image of God. All truth is God's truth. You want to know why to live a life of faith? Because it is true. We live this life of faith because it's not only based in the truth, but because it's based in the reality of the person of who God is. Daniel goes into Babylon, into captivity, his whole life turned upside down. And he learns, he's resolved, he resolves to be faithful to God. And so he learns the truth of what God has for him, even in this place. He learns that God is true, even in Babylon. But he also comes to understand in Babylon that he is not alone, but that God is really and truly and personally present with him, even there. When Daniel goes to draw a line and to speak to his superior and say, this far, no further, God gives him favor and goes with him into that meeting. And when Daniel sets his mind to study, God goes with him and blesses his studying there. And all throughout his captivity, God is present with him in a personal way. He has not just the truth, he has the real and living God. Why live this life of faith? Because in it we live a life with a God who is alive and real and present and with us. The God revealed most powerfully to us in Jesus Christ, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's why we live this life. Because walking any other way would be losing this God who is beyond, indeed, beyond our categories and our small ways of thinking, who is challenging, absolutely, and yet who is a God of such beauty and grace that he has made himself known to us, who has come to us to save us, to take hold of us in his Son, Jesus Christ. came to know that God. And he kept the faith. And so the last verse of the chapter, verse 21, says this, "And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus." And in the first chapter, you have the whole span of Daniel's life. In other words, the trajectory he started on when he resolved faith in this God. He maintained that trajectory long after Nebuchadnezzar was gone and another king was in his place. 70 years of exile. Daniel stayed faithful, ultimately not just because of his resolve, but because there was a real God who was with him through every year of exile, right up to the end. It's the same God who will walk with you every step of the way. Amen.